Hello, everyone, and welcome to Amplify, Phonexa's webinar series, where we bring together industry leaders to talk what's actually changing in performance marketing and what you need to do about it. I'm Dave Pickard, CEO of Phonexa, and I'm excited to be joined today by Curt. We'll dive a little bit more into our companies in a second, but for now, I'll give you a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. The conversations is particularly timely, I think, the CMS ecosystem shifting, the proposed 2027 notice of benefit and payment parameters. We're seeing a clear move towards tighter oversight for ACA and under 65 marketing. I guess from my perspective, and Kurt's the expert here, but from what I'm seeing, what's important here is it's not just a compliance conversation. It really is an operational one. I'm excited to dive into how businesses are interpreting these, how Approve are advising people to adopt these from an operational and a policy perspective and an oversight perspective in general. But also, I'm going to speak as a performance marketer myself. Compliance can be a dry topic. We're going to dive into how this affects marketing teams and the collaboration between marketing teams and compliance teams and how you can really infiltrate a better oversight structure into your company so that this doesn't become a headache and it can actually become a strength by solving these problems. So that's exactly what we're going to unpack. We'll talk through what these changes signal, how they impact the way you manage creative and lead flows, and how bringing together governance and tracking can actually create a more scalable and defensible marketing operation. First of all, welcome, Curt. I'm going to ask you to do a little brief introduction of yourself and Approve, and then I'll maybe do a little overview on the regulation that we're talking about, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. By way of introduction, I'm the CEO at Approve. I actually come from a background in performance marketing myself. I spent about 9.5 years at Google, where I worked first with performance marketers, advising on a lot of the pay-per-click, YouTube, Google search ad practices, and then worked on a team that relates a little bit more to what I do now at Approve. Helped develop our US elections business at Google, including the way that we went through development of policies, review of ads and videos, which started in a very human-centric way and then started to become human plus AI and then AI first. Mm-hmm. We're on a little bit of that journey here at Approve. We are the workflow management tool for regulated content. That's how we view ourselves. And we do that in a few different ways. One is that we want to centralize, provide a platform for all decisions that are made as content is in a work in progress stage or as being approved in an organization. We also want to break down the content that you're creating, whether it be marketing materials, direct mail, website materials, digital materials, and be able to give you insight into the actual materials and where you might have compliance risk. We do that by bringing AI and visual analysis of the materials with AI to flag for your humans where there might be risk. And then we keep all of that in one system and help you stay fast and compliant is our goal. So we work with a lot of different industries, from traditional brands to those that are on the more compliance skewed side, like what we're talking about today with Medicare and ACA marketing. It's been a fun journey, and we always love advising on compliance challenges and hopefully making it easier to produce materials at scale and quickly.
I will say, speaking on behalf of regulated businesses, it's nice to work with people that have a personable approach to it. That's been our experience working with you guys. My background, 12 years in regulated space. I've got an FCA licensed business here in the UK. We've got a financial services network in the US as well, and we built the software system for those businesses. So yeah, very used to dealing with compliance changes and have experience of the good and bad of that, dealing with the right way of adopting those and seeing the wrong way of it happening as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think we'll kind of approach it from two different ends of the spectrum, but hopefully there'll be a lot of alignment. And certainly the way that our companies work together, it seems like we'll agree on a lot of things. So if it's good with you, I'm going to do my attempt at an overview. We spoke very briefly before this conversation for those watching this, and we agreed that this is a big topic and it's going to be difficult to summarize it in a concise manner. But I think for the sake of this conversation, it makes sense to do it so that everyone is aligned on what we're talking about, and then we can decide, do we agree that this is the summary, and do we dive deeper into other things as well. So broadly speaking, the key changes, let's start with costs and fees, and these are my notes. Costs and fees remaining mostly unchanged. Insurance companies will pay similar fees as before. Rules for balancing risk between insurers are updated slightly. We can jump into what that looks like. Next theme will be more flexibility in insurance plans themselves. Insurers are going to get more freedom to design those plans. There's less standard rules, less sort of cookie cutter approaches, more customization in there. New types of plans might be allowed, including non-traditional ones as well. So again, more creativity, and cheaper, higher deductible catastrophic plans may expand as well. Again, probably creating a lot more compliance overhead as to how you defend those plans coming into fruition and how you actually package those. Marketplace wise, which is again pretty important for us as a tracking platform, how this is going to play out. States are going to get more control over running their own exchanges. New options like, states can get let private websites, i.e. the brokers, actually handle the enrollment itself instead of government sites as it is right now. That's a pretty big one. And then changes to the covered benefits themselves. Routine adult dental care may no longer be required as a basic covered benefit. And then in terms of oversight, which is probably one of the area that we're going to jump into more heavily, tighter checks on who actually qualifies for subsidies, especially immigration status and additional verification and enforcement checks to reduce improper payments, essentially. That's my whistle-stop tour. It took me 35 minutes to try and drill that down into what was a 1-minute segment, hopefully. And there's a lot I've missed out, obviously, but the purpose of that really was just to kind of cover as much of it as possible. If you're good, Curt, I'm going to start diving into some questions. And feel free, by the way, to interject and correct any of the stuff that I got wrong in that first intro.
No, I think you did a really good job. I will jump in. I'll give you the marketing perspective of the rule. Yep. Because I think I forget how many pages the proposed rule change was, but it was hundreds of pages, and there's a lot in there. A lot of it has to do with plan operations, and that's all important. But there's some really specific points that are targeted at performance marketers and marketers overall. We boiled it down to a few that we think are relevant, probably for our conversation, but also like signal relevance for others in compliant industries who do marketing. I think a lot of folks look at like Medicare as one of the standard bearers of what good regulated marketing looks like. If you can operate in Medicare as a compliant marketer, you can operate pretty much anywhere. And a lot of these changes start to reflect how Medicare operates. And the changes that we've been kind of keeping eyes on with our customers and those who are kind of talking to us, there's 5, and they're kind of related to each other. So one is that marketing and enrollment communications for ACA are now separated in both rules and enforcement, basically meaning that they kind of have their own categories, they have their own rules, and they have their own enforcement mechanisms. Basically, that means that marketing is now going to be more enforceable and allows for a national standard body to enforce marketing. So a little bit more like Medicare, there's now like marketing rules that will be drafted. They'll probably change every year, and everyone in the ACA space will have to abide by those. So basically, you need to take those seriously. There's also on the enrollment side, there's some language that defines standards of conduct with a clear focus on opt-in, both to the plan, like the form of application and opt-in. There's also some language around marketing opt-in. So on the enrollment side, there's quite a bit going on. Basically, that I think from a marketing perspective, that may increase the barrier to entry for opt-ins and put more onus on the in-house teams to fully own their enrollment goals. It probably puts more pressure on partners and like intermediaries, brokers to be really compliance first in how they're managing opt-in. And that touches probably both Approve and Phonexa's position. And then there's the actual number 3, the new marketing standards of conduct. So baseline rules and explicit prohibitive practices. So they're starting with a list of what you're not allowed to say in marketing materials, which are pretty clear. It's, anything that might be discriminatory language, inaccurate statements, misleading language. You have to have correct information about all the plan materials. But there's quite a bit in there that becomes a checklist of what you want to look for as you're rolling out a campaign. And then probably the biggest one is that they're introducing marketing enforcement. So if you are investigated for violations in your marketing materials, you now have a requirement to produce marketing materials upon request. So there's an auditability requirement. And also you own your, what they call downstream partnerships. So if you have folks who are doing lead generation for you, if you're working with agencies or brokers, you're also responsible for the content that they're putting out on behalf of the plan. So
that was going to be my question, actually. So you segued into the perfect topic for me. So I'm going to throw some scenarios at you, if it's okay, and you can give me some ideas of where you think that stands. So enrollment versus marketing oversight. So you are a carrier. Let's say you're doing the underwriting, you're providing the service. You are engaging with, let's call them affiliates at this stage. But those affiliates are not engaging with you exclusively. They are generating consumer intent. They are generating leads in our space on the Phonexa side. They're using a distribution software like a Phonexa or similar to generate, qualify, validate, defraud and everything, and then distribute that to a suitable carrier that's going to facilitate that product. So that you are receiving that individual introduction exclusively, but you are not the exclusive recipient of all of their leads, for example. So where would the oversight lie on that, whereby, the enroller, for example, is liable for the marketing collateral on the basis that they are receiving consumers off the back of these marketing campaigns, but they're not receiving receiving it exclusively. I was building a picture in my head when you were talking there as a marketing partner. Let's call them an agency, an AOR, for example, promoting the service of this enrollment agency. Fine, that's very easy. The line in the sand there is very clear as to who's responsible for that. What if they're an out-and-out publisher, an aggregator, for example?
Yeah.
How do you see that working?
That's a good question. I would actually, first of all, say that the language that we're discussing today is still in proposal form. Although, from my understanding, the comment window was relatively short, which means they're serious about these rules. And there are some, at least in the 2027 plan guidelines, there's still some gray area around like exactly how some of these things will be enforced. But there's a couple things that I'll point out. I don't think that even like our legal team, lawyers, I think are still figuring out exactly how to interpret some of these. So like take this all with a grain of salt. And when it's fully published, there will be more clarity on this, but I think a spirit of these rules will actually end up happening. If you're an intermediary, if you're a lead aggregator, or you're working maybe on behalf of a host of different companies, first and foremost, you are responsible for all of the content that is coming out of your organization, and all of that content that's being pushed on behalf of ACA overall. Same would go with CMS. You're responsible for the enforcement standards of those materials. So you should be ready to, if investigated for any reason, to produce evidence of what materials ran, ran where, potentially like going down to your call script level, potentially also being able to show things like your digital marketing materials, any direct mail that you were running. So that is your responsibility as a marketer. Downstream accountability, you as a plan, it's not yet entirely clear if the plans are responsible for all of the downstream accountability in their entire content supply chain, or if it is siloed more to intermediaries and their content supply chain. I don't want to answer that and give bad guidance, but what is clear is that they're establishing a principle of downstream accountability. And so I think that will probably evolve over time, to be honest. But I think that what you're going to see is just more pressure overall on partners. So if you are anywhere in that content supply chain, I think that the payers, like the large plans, they're going to be paying attention to this because they have brand risk, even if they don't have direct legal risk. And I think they see where this is going. And so there's going to be, a push towards, can you prove your work? Can you show what your organizational standards are? And do you have a platform, or do you have a means of showing that you're abiding by these standards?
It reminds me somewhat of sorry to interject, it reminds me a little bit of the FCA infrastructure here in the UK, where we have an aggregation service for loans, credit cards, credit in general. We have a panel of north of 100 lenders. I say we as in a sister company of Phonexa, and similar advice from the regulator kind of saying, look, that we expect these best practices to be carried out, but a kind of, I'm going to say, lack of definition as to where that ownership actually starts and ends. And we've taken the ownership to just kind of say, well, the expectation here is audit trails. Build a level of defense for every decision you make in your company, from how that marketing creative came about, how version 1 came about, why version 2 then was the version that it became, what customers that creative then generated, the journey they went down, including, digital and offline interactions with the company as well. And then all the way through to who that customer was presented to, why they were presented to that potential recipient, and then further audit trails following that. So what happened to that customer post delivery, being able to defend all of that, and being able to have, for example, we'll have customer centric board meetings with board minutes and notes to kind of say, okay, this meeting is exclusively about vulnerability and customer journey and improving our tracking of why we made the decisions we did, so that, yes, we're living in a gray area of, okay, we're not actually sure what the regulator wants from us here, but we have a lot. We have a lot of defense. We have a lot of minutes and audit trails to actually build. And so that if we did have a conversation with the regulator in this, the likelihood is they may just come back and say, okay, that step, tweak that, which is really allowing them to do their job too, right? They're actually able to come in and review something and give you concise feedback, which I think is the goal here as well. Would you say that that's a fair assumption right now? And obviously, like you say, things are going to change, but that's probably a safe setup.
Yeah, I like the way that you frame that, because what you essentially are saying is advising that you should build a compliant process. And in the event of an audit, the conversation can become about your process, not about the violation. And I do think when you have this big of a shift in like ACA marketing, I think it's clear that you need to be building, a forward-thinking process. First of all, because this signals future change that, if you take Medicare as an example, will only become stricter over time. So you're probably smart to be building an auditable process that's really like a top-down organizational priority that is built for stricter accountability than what we see here. It's a tough challenge. I mean, you're mentioning kind of like how you connect with your consumer, which that's a challenge. And I think where we come at it is, how do you produce, actual marketing materials that are compliant at really large scale? And we tend to work with people who are generating in brands who are sometimes, have multiple sub brands, sometimes are producing materials across brand marketing, direct mail, digital, and oftentimes you have multiple agencies that are creating that material as well. And so we definitely believe that you want to have a system of record for how you're making these decisions. I mentioned at the beginning of our call, like, we believe there's a role for AI here, not to make decisions, but to flag risk for you and bring you to the risk. The most important part, though, is that if you can make this about your process and not about an audit that comes your way and a single piece of marketing material, you're probably better defended than, having to argue about whether the actual direct mail piece that went out was violating the rules or not.
Yeah, you said, if you're talking about a violation, you're essentially talking about the things you haven't done. Whereas if you're talking about a process, you're not necessarily talking about the violation. You're actually talking about, help me improve. Here's all the things I've invested as the company towards compliance and adherence and governance of that. But you tell me what I need to improve. And taking something from 95% to 100% is a conversation that I know the regulators definitely prefer, as opposed to looking at something from a 0% perspective to say, okay, here's all the things you did wrong. And it completely changes the narrative. I hate the word narrative, but in that sense, narrative seems like the right way to talk about that.
So downstream accountability is a big part of the proposal here. How that's enforced is an interesting question. But, I do think insurance providers are going to be thinking about downstream accountability in their partners, in their agents, their brokers, their lead aggregators. And I think if you can show that you do have a process, I think they'll be taking a look at what their content ecosystem and their partner ecosystem looks like. And if you can proactively show a process, I think then, you can become a thought partner and a long-term partner. And I do think there's potential in this rule to kind of disrupt what the partner and downstream ecosystem looks like. And I think you want to be ahead of that. You don't want to be caught when your upstream partner is asking these questions, a plan or operations in place.
Just to speak personally as Phonexa for a second, we're already starting to have some nice conversations from our perspective, because we actually built the software for these types of relationships. We built the software for an aggregation industry where you are not cognizant to the whole customer journey, but your technology and your machine learning / AI infrastructure around it needs to draw your attention to the risks, for example, but also mitigate as many of them as possible prior to them being flagged. Customer journey audits, customer interaction audits, the assumption that a customer enters your database, that's not the only time they've entered your database. I think that's something a lot of people forget about, is when a customer becomes a customer, they were not a customer at some point and they shopped with you around at some point for many. They've received probably 30 or 40 messages from you before they came a customer. Stop looking at it as, for example, last touch attribution. What was the last thing they saw? What were the other messages that went into drawing their attention into this in the first place? We built a lot of technology personally when the one-to-one consent from the FCC was coming in, and obviously that went the way that it did. But we made a hard and fast approach to that, to say, okay, well, our job as a tech provider is just to give our clients all of the possible capabilities to go above and beyond what the regulator is asking for, or interpret it in their own way, and actually get creative about it. As a tech provider, it's not our job necessarily to tell, it's really to build and build flexibility. And a lot of that tech is probably going to be useful for a lot of this introduction as well, in terms of journey tracking and customer auditing and that kind of thing. Just to dive into something then from an exposure perspective then. So when you look at stricter standards coming into place, when these sorts of things come about, and I'm going to generalize this, obviously we're talking about this specific change, but I think we can generalize this. Where do you think most organizations that you work with and speak to are exposed in the modern day?
Good question. So as far as where we see exposure, I'll take the lens of those who are creating marketing materials, which is really where we have a focus. I guess if you think of us as kind of the upstream compliance platform where marketing materials are being created, Phonexa, you operate in that ecosystem, and then kind of downstream as you get into customer communications. There's an interesting kind of like part of segmentation of the marketing funnel, kind of where we both play. But for us, we start to see things break break down on large teams when you have decisions about marketing materials or creation decisions around marketing materials that are living across multiple platforms. We still run into enterprise organizations that are managing work in progress, creation of materials across like email, Slack, other disconnected tools. And when you get into a regulated environment, you really do want a centralized location where you're collaborating, you're documenting everything from decisions to even casual conversation about the materials. And that's the goal that we try to provide as a system of record at Approve. But it starts to break down. I think there's risk the moment that approvals are no longer simple and linear. If you have multiple reviewers or versions, maybe you now have outside agencies and partners, you have maybe a legal or a compliance checkpoint. And potentially in the case of ACA, you might have market-specific variations, you might have language variations of what you're producing. It's easy to lose track of what's current. Feedback gets scattered across different channels. And if you do ever have a situation where you're asked by a partner or an auditor, who signed off on what, how was this approved, that becomes a recreation exercise. We kind of refer to that as the recreation fog. All of a sudden now you have to have a meeting, you have to go through email records. We try to make that really easy, really fast. It can take you 10 minutes to go through an entire project flow and see exactly what happened where. And in a regulated environment, I think that creates real risk if you can't, prove how decisions were made and also show how maybe a project or building a website or website flow or marketing materials, how it changed from, version 1 all the way through what you shipped, and then exactly what shipped and to where is an important question. So that's what auditability looks like. But I think there's a lot of places where auditability can break down in that chain of command.
Speaking on that, we see a lot of clients that obviously we solve a tracking problem. That tracking problem intrinsically educates marketing collateral very well as well. So we see a lot of our clients using those numbers to educate the changes that they make, the split testing, the A/B testing, the segmentation that they run, the personalization of their creatives. But I know for a fact they don't document that, right? It's when you work exclusively on performance and you work with numbers, it's very easy to say, well, the numbers told me to do it. But from a regulatory perspective, that's normally not enough, right? Your tracking platform is not going to be your audit system necessarily. You're not going to say, oh, look, this number went up, so therefore we did more of that, right? So how do you actually flesh that out into a process and into a decision-making engine that your compliance and your marketing teams can work intrinsically together via a system? Your defense still is the numbers. We see more positive consumer behavior and we see more positive engagement with this. And here's how we educated our H1 or our tagline or our creative or our call to action placement and all the things that are obviously going to change in that. Are you seeing similar things with regards to that?
Yeah. And I think too, like as you're building performance marketing materials in a high compliance environment, there's like two questions. How do you do it rapidly, quickly, at a pace that scales? And like, how do you stay compliant? And I know our answer to that has been, it's helpful to have a single system of record where you're making those decisions, where if you're changing a call to action, you're documenting when it changed. You might have some logic around why it changed. Our philosophy is that you can be compliant and you can do it faster, but you need to have an organizational shift on this is important. Sometimes it comes from the CMO, sometimes it comes from COO or an operations center. But we need a single point to accelerate this process, stay compliant. And then you still do need to be producing a wide range of materials to be relevant in today's marketing ecosystem. That's not easy. So, speed plus compliance, you really do need good process, I think, to get there on having both at the same time.
Where do you stand on the use of AI in creative management then? So we partner with and see a lot of our clients use AI-based platforms to either auto-optimize landing pages or funnels or email creatives and all these kinds of things. We offer some advice to encourage the start and end of where that creativity should be allowed to go. How do you guys handle that? How do you guys handle that from an advice perspective? How does it work within the approved infrastructure? Let's talk about that.
That's a great question. So obviously AI is rapidly changing most industries. I think marketing is probably more exposed than most because you can do some incredible things with AI. So I think first, every team needs to figure out how they can use it in a way that's respectful, compliant, productive. We don't necessarily provide guidance on how to use it in the production of assets, but we're kind of on the converse, actually. Like once you've made decisions around how you're using AI, you should know that there's risk involved in using AI, and there's a role for humans to play. The role of a platform like ours at Approve is that we want to be the chain of command of any assets that run through your organization, and we want to reduce that risk for you. And the way that we do that, we use AI almost in the opposite way, where we can understand your organizational rules, we can understand the ACA rules that we're talking about here, and we have agents that will scan your materials and will provide you intelligent AI generated feedback on any of the materials that you upload. So our thought is, look, if you're going to use AI in the front end of your creation and in the way that you're building marketing materials, we want to give you the opportunity to use it in a defensive and compliance first way so that nothing gets through the cracks of your organizational norms so that you do stay compliant. And so we have a tool that you can choose to deploy or not, kind of depending on your organizational standards, where we'll review a whole batch of marketing creatives that are coming through your organization, really anything you can imagine. We do 150 different types of assets, and we'll go through and flag where we think there is risk, and you can route that to the right person in your organization for a review. Or you might want humans to have a first pass, and then you can use AI if you're not sure. So we have a lot of flexibility. You can choose how you want to deploy AI, but our philosophy is we have an open AI philosophy. You can choose any LLM that you prefer. You can pull it into our tool. Our value is that we extract everything we can out of the marketing material. We know what the marketing material is, and we can give you feedback on it. Hopefully people are experimenting with it, but our goal is to give you the tools on the back end of your process so that if you are experimenting on the front end, you're reducing the risk in what's actually getting through the final stage of your process.
I like that. It's almost like I'm picturing an AI versus AI. May the strongest LLM win.
It's the battle of the AI.
Exactly. Defense versus attack.
But again, I was at Google for a long time, and AI is incredibly powerful at optimization, at writing content, doing it very well. So I think there's a time and a place for it. How it manifests in regulated industries is really interesting. And I think there's definitely more risk in regulated industries. We have clients who won't use it. We have some who do. I guess our goal is to make it so that you can feel more confident experimenting, whether you're doing it with humans or with AI in your production.
Yeah. No, our stance for a while was we were heavily machine learning. Like a lot of our reporting in Phonexa was data led. At the time of us creating that stance, it was AI was not ready. I just had this fear factor of saying, okay, I'm going to feed all my machine learning reports into an AI algorithm, and it's going to break everything we've just built for the last 10 years. Yeah. Now it's a completely different conversation to say, okay, actually now we can set real framework around this to the point where we're envisioning, AI account-based affiliate management AI agents in there to jump into your system and say, hey, by the way, Dave, your redirect rate or your customer engagement rate of this marketing campaign is down today. I think it's to do with the H1 change. It's crazy the kind of stuff that we're seeing right now. And it's great for us because, we built our platform for efficiency, right? And we see some of the biggest aggregators globally use our system with some of the most efficient, smallest teams. If you look at the number of customer interactions they generated versus the team size, you'd be like, how do they do it? And it's purely with efficient software, of which AI can be an extension of that. We can quite easily dive into AI for too long. So I'm going to segue back to somewhere else. So at the start, we kind of spoke about, and I think you kind of gave this as what you see being a central change in the upcoming update being, that clear differentiation between enrollment practices versus marketing practices. What else do you see? You said, okay, now this is another big change that companies are going to have to be prepared for.
Yeah, I think as you look at the ACA space, obviously there's more oversight with kind of enrollment. But if you look at the Medicare space as kind of the beacon of where CMS views that kind of being the pinnacle of regulated marketing, the rules, frankly, they get stricter every year. And so the fact that we're finding rules essentially for the 2027 plan year, and we have marketing enforcement. If you look at Medicare being probably where this is going, the enforcement and the rules have gotten stricter every year. I think a signal that people should be taking this seriously. And by the way, like other industries tend to follow what Medicare does in many cases. Medicare is kind of on the leading edge of marketing enforcement. So, I think even if you're not in this industry, like keep an eye on this. It's potentially where other regulations will go. I think broadly, like zooming out from the ACA, as these regulations evolve, companies need to rethink creative governance as a continuous control model, not necessarily like a final checkpoint. And I've kind of mentioned this throughout our conversation, but for a long time, governance was treated as something that happened at the end of your process.
Yeah.
Creative like develops the asset, maybe people weigh in, and then at the very end, you have, legal or compliance review it. That approach, if you look at where Medicare's gone, when you have this level of enforcement and auditability, it's hard to scale with that approach. And so, they built an entire process and operational mindset around start with compliance, build or buy tools or bring software into your platform that can enforce that compliance so that it's not happening at the end of your process. You're getting feedback all the way throughout. And I think that's like one of the main takeaways for me is, okay, this is happening now in the ACA, but if you're in another form of insurance, it's not that you need to adhere to these rules, but this is, I think, a direction of where things might be going in the regulated space. It's good to learn, I think, from those who found a way to even accelerate their process while dealing with this level of regulation and reducing their organizational risk.
I like how you describe that. I think a lot of organizations see their marketing teams get quite disillusioned with compliance and governance and oversight because it's often that last checkpoint and all they see is note disapproved, back to stage one, change this. And they see compliance as, revenue blockers, for example. We do see companies handle this properly and actually ingest governance early on in the creative journey. And I actually see the marketing teams enjoy that because they are now educated on what they can and can't say, why they can and can't say it. And the creative marketers, of which, the best will obviously rise and survive in this industry for longer, will use that to actually inspire their creativity. A lot of them, like I said earlier, they use data, they use numbers, they use analysis, and they use industry research to do it. Well, actually bringing in the governance, you can't get away from the fact you're working in a regulated space. You need to acknowledge it. My consensus has always been when I work in regulated spaces, I kind of like it. It's like a rule book. No one's going to come along to me later and tell me I did something wrong because I followed a set of rules. I'd much rather build a revenue stream with a rule book and go and pay my mortgage off with money made from that than anything where, someone, in the dark shadows can come along later and say, oh, by the way, Dave, you did that all wrong. So I like the way you describe it. I think it's a way of thinking, not to get too deep and spiritual on it, but I think definitely a reframing of how you structure your creative oversight in your company. If you were building a team today, let's say you're jumping into an organization that Approve are working with, and they say, Curt, build my team, build my compliance oversight, my structure. What are the first steps you would be taking and first pieces of advice you would be giving them to get them audit ready while still acknowledging the fact, they may be a startup, they might want to remain quick to launch and growth focused?
So I'll take my Approve hat off. It's a great question. I think one of the beacons for compliant marketing is the Medicare space. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that you have really strict marketing rules in the Medicare space. You have a really serious enforceability and penalty for non-compliance, including serious fines. And there's fines that are levied almost every year. And then you have a short operating window where it's called AEP, where you are launching all of your materials. So everything has to go through formal checks before that. So it really is the nexus of speed, compliance, and limited time frame. And so I really think the marketing experience in the Medicare space is incredibly stressful. And every year the rules change. So the game just constantly shifts. But one of the things I've seen from the Medicare space and working there, kind of having the pleasure of consulting on process, is that every year they do a really good job of stepping back. That happens, January, February, March, partially because they're on cycle, but they redesign many of their processes. They think organizationally about how they're going to meet the bar for the coming year. And then oftentimes they do make serious changes. There's an element of, this is being driven by rule changes, but there's kind of a beautiful part of it, which is that you get the ability every cycle to do a debrief on what's been working well, on gaps in your tech stack, on gaps in your organizational stack. And it's very much a top-down process from the C-level down. So you have buy-in on doing an organizational discovery, and you can set new goals. I think if I were advising a team today, I would say learn from that. Invest the time to sit down with your entire team hopefully from a top-down support perspective. If you are a leader listening to this call, it's a great charge for your team. Hopefully take this seriously. I think the first step is to probably stop treating audit readiness as a scramble. That takes, again, organizational design. You have to centralize elements of that process, create a clear system of record. In our world, it's for every asset and approval decision. You want that documented. And again, bring compliance into into your workflow earlier. Hopefully it's not a bottleneck right at the very end before you launch. And I think that's what lets companies stay fast. You're bringing issue detection really far upstream. And so when you're getting through a project or you're launching creative, you've already had eyes on it or you've had AI eyes on it. But I think what's beautiful about the Medicare space is just that you have this cycle where everyone sits down and they really think deeply about their process every year. And I think that leads to innovation. And that innovation comes because they're in such a constrained environment. Many of the listeners here aren't in that constrained environment, but because of that, you maybe don't have the debrief that you should.
But you can maybe create that opportunity in the organization if it's something that you're missing. Yeah.
I think sometimes that opportunity only comes from like a crisis, like actually going through an audit, but you can learn a lot from doing it far before you get to that point.
Looking back at my experience in regulation change, one of the biggest that we experienced here in the UK was GDPR's inception. And you touched on something earlier, which is there are often, ripple effect regulations that come into force, of which I think the GDPR was, where a lot of the rest of the world, particularly Europe at the time, and now certainly California and then, further states to follow, regarding how customers should expect their data to be utilized and used, what types of communication methods they should expect to receive post digital engagement. And when that regulation came into force, the stance that I took was I kind of somewhat predicted the deadline day privacy policy en masse. Everyone's emailing you their updated privacy policy. Oh, by the way, we have your data and this is how we're going to use it, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And I kind of thought, well, that's going to happen. I actually took the deadline day off as vacation. I remember it specifically because I was like, I'm going to set my goal of having that day off on the basis that I was ready 6 months prior. GDPR came into force for me 6 months prior to that date. So I've actually been learning the effect of this new data processing regime for 6 months. When the regime comes into force, I'm not perfect, but I've had 6 months head start on everyone else. And everyone else is still scrambling to kind of get their ducks in a row, but they're also competing with everyone else that's also scrambling at the same time. And it just becomes this cycle of noise. So I think what you're touching on there, you're right. I think that rise to the top here will be those that, first of all, learn to adopt early, but also learn to operate smart. Work smart, not hard is kind of an approach to this, where actually using technology, using, common sense processes, educating the right teams and involving the right stakeholders and creating that time of review. Like you just said, then some businesses don't have the fortuitous situation to have those annual review opportunities, but I can promise you they can probably create them. Using those opportunities to say, okay, this is a way of actually building a competitive advantage against others. Not everyone is going to adopt these perfectly, which is always the case. How do we make sure that we give ourselves the edge to either automate more, track more, build more defenses, or simply educate our teams to an extent where actually we have that advantage? There's so many opportunities here that I think it's creating to give yourself another edge. Hopefully you're already a company with some edges, and this is just another one. Any final thoughts from you before I thank our wonderful audience for attending?
Actually, my final thought is that you mentioned GDPR. And I think like going back to this rule change, one of the things I think marketers are going to find and are struggling with now is just that you obviously have CCPA here in the United States, which is California driven. You have many other states that have their own regulation that are now determining compliance on the healthcare level, whether you're thinking ACA or broadly, if you're operating in the insurance space, there's many different states that have their own regulations around what's required in marketing materials. And that's a place where we often will work and will automate compliance checks, because you might find yourself producing 16 to 25 different individual assets if you're operating across all these different states. And that's the reality. I mean, this is a really serious challenge to market at scale in increasing regulatory and compliance environment. And, you mentioned GDPR, like that's kind of happening here on a state by state basis now. It's really challenging. So we're happy to be thought leaders in that. I know you are as well. And hopefully it leads to some good conversations. Also interesting times, again, to be kind of blending the role of humans and AI. And that's kind of, I think, what you probably think a lot about. It's what we think a lot about too.
Absolutely. A lot of moving parts, but us not shying away from our obligations to the space to kind of go, we still have a role to play here to keep the important topics central, utilize the right infrastructure, and ultimately just educate our clients to be able to make the right decisions. No decision is polarized. Like there's not a guaranteed 1 and 0 response to everything. So how do we build processes and infrastructure to go, okay, well, my software allows them to track user journeys start to end so that at the end of it, they can make a smarter decision. And your software allows allows them to defend the decisions they've made along the way to actually generate those customers in the first place. Hopefully that's quite a good summary of what our businesses do together. I mean, it's maybe a good time to thank the audience for attending. Hopefully we covered a lot of interesting topics. It's hard to do this in 30 minutes. I will say my 2-minute summary of regulation at the start was in an attempt to give us 28 spare minutes to actually dive into some questions, but there's definitely a lot we didn't talk about. Maybe we'll do another one of these, but hopefully it sparks some questions from some audience members. By all means, reach out. Curt definitely has his specialist topics that I cannot speak to, and by all means, reach out to him for anything that he's covered. And likewise, if any of you guys need some tracking solutions solved, whether that's in the web lead space or in the call space, by all means, reach out to us at Phonexa. Curt, thank you for your time. Thank you for making it interesting and fun to talk about regulatory changes. That's not always the case, but yeah, I can certainly see that you're an expert, a thought leader in the space, and I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for having me. Great to spend some time with you. And I'm always at cb@approved.com and happy to discuss with anyone who's on the call and maybe weighing these things. And great to see you, Dave. Thanks for having me.
And I will say I'm Dave at Phonexa.com. It's a good point. Tell people how to contact you. Thanks, Curt.